Our next discussion will deal with the growing impact of anti-Israel trends on the United States progressive left. And I'm honored to welcome the keynote speaker of this session, a man who needs no introduction, but I will introduce him, Professor Alan Morton Dershowitz. Professor Dershowitz, the Felix Frankfurter Professor of Law Emeritus, Harvard University, is a renowned media contributor, political commentator, and legal analyst known for his work in U.S. constitutional law and American criminal law, and for taking high-profile cases. Dershowitz is an author of over 50 books. Please, Professor Dershowitz.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be addressing so distinguished a group of pro-Israel supporters. And I want to start with the bad news. The bad news is that the future of Israel-American relationships is in grave danger. Not for today, not necessarily for tomorrow, but for the day after tomorrow, for our children's and our grandchildren's generation. If nothing is done to change the current trend, the relationship will suffer. One of the messages I'm going to give you today, and I'm going to save it toward the end, is that Israel must prepare to go to it alone without the support of the United States. It must adopt a doomsday strategy in relation to U.S.-American relationship. And it can, and it will, because Israel has the will to survive, and it will survive. But that's how serious the danger is. Again, not today, but for the day after tomorrow. The primary goal of the anti-Israel movement, and it's very strong, is to sever the relationship between the United States and Israel. That's the goal. It starts with Students for Justice for Palestine. That's the stimulus, but as some of our speakers have mentioned, this isn't so much a pro-Palestine situation as it is an anti-Israel and deep down an anti-Jewish threat. And so the canary in the mine has always been the universities. They are the future. When I looked at my students, I taught at Harvard for 50 years, and I've been involved in pro-Israel activities for more than 60 years on campuses. When I see and hear from my students, I know what the country is going to be like 10 years from now. Because the students who sit in front of me 10 years from now are going to be the United States senators, the United States congresspeople, the editors of the New York Times, the senior partners of Goldman Sachs. And so what's going on university campuses today is the key to projecting forward. And the key to Israel's success has always been it doesn't focus only on today and tomorrow. It focuses on the day after tomorrow. And so it has to look at what's going on in colleges and campuses in terms of what impact it will have tomorrow. We have to anticipate trends, and we have to make sure that we are ahead of the trends and are prepared for every eventuality, including the unexpected. We have to prepare for the unexpected. We have to make sure we have our think tanks, our strategy ready for a time when we can't count on the current relationship between Israel and the United States remaining as strong as it has been. Let me first distinguish between 4 or 5 different groups of people in the United States. They are reflected on college campuses, but they generally reflect what's going on in the United States. Let's start with one of the more visible ones. And when I talk about some of these issues, I always get a pushback. Why are you talking so much about the left? Why are you talking about progressives? Why are you talking about the wokes? The real problem is on the anti-Semitic white supremacist right. Total nonsense. Ignore the right. Ignore the hard anti-Semitic white supremacists. Call the cops on them. Make sure that they can't do violence. Make sure that you arrest them when they do violence. But they have no influence today on American universities. None. and no influence on the future of American relationships with Israel. Everybody condemns the anti-Semitic attacks on the synagogues, the anti-Semitic attacks on other Jewish institutions. There is no debate about that. Nobody will defend them. So they are unimportant. And they can't be balanced as so many people do. Oh, there's threats from the left and threats from the right. No, there are only threats from the left, not from the right at all. So that's the first group. Ignore them. Don't focus on them at all. The second group are right-wing evangelicals and right-wing Trump supporters. Even there, you have to make a distinction. Right-wing evangelicals, even though there is a history of anti-Semitism among some right-wing evangelicals, they are solidly in support of Israel. They are to Israel pro as what the woke is to the left. They're unbudgeable. They will support Israel. I spoke at Liberty University a few years ago, and I was told by a woman, an evangelical Christian, she said, there are only two countries I would give up my life for. One is the United States and the other is Israel. So they can be counted on. The Trump pro-Israel group is a little thinner and can't necessarily be as much counted on, as well as Trump himself. I mean, he goes both ways. He goes all ways, and he brings with him lots of people. So that's not a group that necessarily can be counted on, but it's a group that lends great support to Israel. Of course, it creates a counter. Anything Trump does is bad among certain people, so Trump's recognition of Israel, the Golan Heights, et cetera, is seen as negative because Trump did it, just because Trump did it. Okay, then there is the center-right. The center-right is generally pro-Israel and generally can be relied on. Then there's the center-left, which we'll talk about in a minute because they're really at risk. And then there's the hard woke left, which we all agree is hopeless and nothing can be done really about them. Then the groups have to be divided racially as well. There are African American groups, there are Muslim groups, there are groups that are trying to create representativeness in America. And representativeness in America means that proportional representation. There aren't enough African Americans in Major League Baseball, only 7%. And if you focus on quotas like that, 13% at universities, and you say that every group has to be proportionally represented, that means that Jews are going to be represented at the level of 2 or 3%. I'm not worried about Major League Baseball. We got Bregman, we got a couple other good guys in there, but I'm not worried about that. I'm not worried that we're represented more in the ownership of the NBA than in players in the NBA. What I am worried about is university admissions. I'm worried about important jobs in government. And if we get to the point of numerus clausus, which is we had in Europe for many, many years, sorry. Okay, I can hold this if you give it to me. Okay, now we're fine. Once we get to the point of America having to represent every group in proportion to its population, we get to what happened during the immigrations of 1910 and 1915, where Jews are kept out, numerus clausus at universities, etc. And it will affect the influence of Jews in America over the years. So that's something to watch very, very carefully, the Supreme Court decision coming down on that. I think it will be decided, in my opinion, in the right way, and it will say that race cannot be constitutionally a factor in university admissions, and that will hopefully at least cause a temporary halt to the representational aspects of American life. It'll also cause a reaction by the left. The left will say there are too few this, too few that, too many Jews. In the end, when you say too few blacks, you are saying too many Jews. In fact, yesterday we heard about David Chappelle, the comedian, and he was talking on Saturday Night Live, and he was trying to mock kind of the concerns that Jews have today. And then he said, well, I just want to tell you a fact. Just a fact, he said. I go to Hollywood, what do I see? All I see is Jews, Jews, Jews. There are so many of them. in Hollywood. Yeah, and there are a lot of Jews on Wall Street because they worked very hard to get there, and because they lived by a meritocracy. And we're seeing a challenge to the meritocracy today, and a challenge to the meritocracy will be very, very hurtful to the Jewish community, to the Asian American community, to many communities, and that's why there have to be alliances between the Jewish community and other communities that will suffer from the end of meritocracy. My fear, and I think a number of our brilliant speakers have focused on it, is that the trend is toward making anti-Semitism acceptable in the center, where it was only acceptable on the hard right and the hard left. But I have a different view from some of our speakers. I think one of the greatest problems on university campuses today, and I can attest to this from personal experience and from speaking to students, is not that the middle, not even the Jewish middle, is turning against Israel. It's that they don't want to have anything to do with Israel. It's the easy way out. Yes, they're given a choice, and a lot of them opt for a middle choice. They won't be anti-Israel, they won't be pro-Israel, they just don't care about Israel. This notwithstanding the fact that there has never, in my experience, been more pro-Israel activism on American college campuses than there is today. That is, Chabad has made an enormous difference, and I have to be very proud about that. I helped bring Chabad to Harvard, and there are now more than 300 Chabads at universities all over the world. And the irony, listen to this irony. The irony is that although Chabad is technically anti-Zionist, it can't accept Zionism halachically, the Chabad people are the most pro-Israel people on every college campus. And there's more pro-Israel activism today on university campuses than ever before. And so you get the situation where there's more anti-Israel activism, more pro-Israel activism, and then there's that big, giant, enormous center. Now, what I said about pro-Israel and anti-Israel does not apply to the faculty. There is no pro-Israel activity on the part of faculty in the United States of America. Let me be very clear about that. There's no greater group of silent hypocrites on American universities than tenured full professors of Jewish background. They call me all the time. I've spoken at hundreds of college campuses around the country. I get the same call after every speech, and it's always in a low whisper. Thank you, Alan, for speaking up on behalf of Israel. Well, why won't you speak up on behalf of Israel? Well, my student evaluations, my possibilities for promotion, my entry into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. I was blackballed from the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Let me tell you just a little story about that. The American Academy of Arts and Sciences is reserved for scholars who are public intellectuals, who also have an impact on the public, who write popular books as well as traditional books. If there was ever a picture of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the paradigm of who should be in it, it's me. I mean, I'm obviously a public intellectual, somebody who speaks about things in public. I don't reserve my life only to the ivory tower, but I was blackballed. And I asked why I was blackballed, and I was blackballed because I am too Israeli, too pro-Israeli. And that message gets sent. I don't care about that. I have my career. But for young people who want tenure or who want to be admitted to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, that is a crucial factor. And therefore, you cannot count on any faculty. And when students can't look to faculty, and when faculty sometimes even send subtle messages that they would much prefer not to see pro-Israel advocacy among their students, that sends a very, very powerful and very, very dangerous message. So it's not getting better, it's getting worse. And when you have a center that used to be pro-Israel and is not now anti-Israel, but it just doesn't care about Israel, it makes it easier for the hard left, woke, anti-Israel people to get their way on university campuses. When I speak to university presidents and I say to them, or deans, I say to them, why aren't you speaking out more against the anti-Zionism? And the answer is there's no constituency pushing us in that direction. The constituency is pushing us very strongly in the opposite direction. Now, I always thought, you know, the optimist-pessimist story we heard before, I was always a little bit optimistic because in my experience, I saw college students becoming very anti-Israel, but when they got to law school and medical school and business school, they turned much more pro-Israel. That has stopped. And the paradigm for that is the University of California at Berkeley, a great law school headed by Erwin Chemerinsky, a great Zionist progressive dean, one of the people who really can help out enormously. 14 clubs, including the feminists at Berkeley, including gays at Berkeley, including South Asians at Berkeley, blacks at Berkeley, have all issued a diktat now. They've changed their constitutions, and they prohibit anybody who is a Zionist from speaking on any subject. So that, for example, I can't give a speech to feminists about abortion and the Supreme Court. I can't give a speech to African American students about affirmative action. I can't give a speech to Asian students about the Japanese detention of 110,000 people. I am verboten. I have to take a loyalty oath. I won't. Obviously, I'm a proud Zionist critical of Israel, as I am critical of the United States, and I am critical of every country. I just railed against the Ukraine recently, even though I support Ukraine and Russia, but the chutzpah of Ukraine demanding help from Israel when they vote against them at the UN, when they honor Nazis, and when they won't take into consideration Israel's security needs. No, I'm going to be critical of countries that I support, including Israel. But that's not what's happening. As our speakers very correctly pointed out, it's not about 67, it's about 48. And it's about 47. It's about the UN partition plan. It's about ignoring the fact that the Palestinians had the ability to have a state 7 times in the last 50 or 60 or 70 years and turned it down. Again, it's not about the Palestinians. Palestinians are the luckiest group in the world that their perceived enemies are the Jews. If they didn't have their perceived enemies being the Jews, they'd be the Kurds. They'd be ignored. The only reason the Palestinians have gotten the attention of the world is because their perceived enemy is the nation state of the Jewish people. So is it going to get better? I don't see the symptoms of it getting better. And so I think Israel has to be prepared for the eventual reduction in U.S. support. Now, obviously, the crisis will come when, if and when, hopefully it never will happen, but if and when, the Israeli national security people, the brilliant intelligence people, tell the leaders of Israel, you have no choice. Iran is about to develop deliverable nuclear weapons, and any country in the world would prevent that. And Iran is about to do it. They're just months or weeks away from it. And Israel decides to make this horrible existential decision to risk its own pilots, to risk its own north from Hezbollah responses, and to take the existential step of attacking Iran. At that point, the question is going to be, what will be America's attitude? Will America support? Will it join them? Probably not. Will it support them? Will it prevent them? Will it threaten them? Will it sanction them? That's tomorrow's problem, not the day after tomorrow. That's tomorrow's problem, and we don't know the firm answer to that. Tom Friedman, in addition to his terrible article the other day, also said that Biden may be the last Democrat pro-Israel president elected. That the next Democrat, the next left-leaning person elected as president of the United States will not be pro-Israel. I think that overstates it, but I worry about it as well. So what can Israel do? It can do a great deal. It has to be prepared for this possible eventuality. We all hope it doesn't occur. We may even think it won't occur, but it has to be prepared for when it occurs. You know, every day when we daven, we talk about the great gift that God gave us da'at, bina, chachma, intelligence. And for thousands of years, the Jewish people used their da'at and their chachma and their bima, their intelligence, to help other people, to develop science, to develop literature, to develop other things. Israel changed all that. Israel, for the first time in Jewish history, the Jewish people used their brilliance to protect themselves, because all the dot in the world didn't help during the Holocaust. People went to the gas chambers with brilliant thoughts in their minds, because we had been brought up to hope for the day when our swords will be turned into plowshares. Tragically, today we have to turn our plowshares into swords. And we have to use the technology that Israel has, and I want to give you one word that will save Israel: indispensable. Israel only will prevail if it becomes indispensable. Indispensable to America, indispensable to the Gulf states, indispensable to everybody who opposes Iran, indispensable to Europe, indispensable to the world. And Israel can become indispensable through its science, through its technology, through its startup nation. And it has to be thinking in those terms. I hate to be delivering that message, because it is a message more of pessimism than optimism. But as I've always advised my clients over 50 years, you always must be prepared for the unexpected. You always have to be 5 steps ahead of the other side. And if that's what a client has to do, much more seriously, Israel has to do that. Again, going back to the Jewish tradition, Hashem oz li'amo yitain, says the prophet. Hashem oz li'amo yitain. Hashem yivarech et amo b'shalom. Now the message of that is clear. Without oz, there will be no shalom. Israel must remain the strongest country, the most adept country, the wisest country, the most indispensable country. It cannot simply rely on the goodwill of others. It has to rely on its ability to defend itself, and on those of us, Americans and other people around the world, who you can always count on. Never have to doubt our reserve and our resolve. We will be there to help you, but you always have to help yourself. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Dershowitz. Please stay on stage while we'll hear the next lectures. Thank you for your fascinating lecture. And I would like to invite the next speaker. Please welcome Susan Heller-Pinto, Vice President of International Policy in ADL. At her role, Susan Heller-Pinto oversees ADL's work combating anti-Semitism and hate outside the United States and supporting Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. Susan joined ADL in 1993 as Assistant Director of Middle Eastern Affairs and has worked for nearly 3 decades to develop and promote ADL's international affairs priorities. Susan, please. Do you want to be here or you want to hold it?
Maybe I'll hold it.
Okay.
And sorry, how do I move the...
I think this is it.
Oh, okay. 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 Hi. So it's a tough position to be in, to go after Professor Dershowitz. So thank you, Rאות. Thank you, INSS. Thank you, Yossi, for inviting me here today. Just a few words about ADL for those of you who are unaware. ADL has been around since 1913. We call ourselves the leading anti-hate organization in the world. Our mission developed in 1913, and I've been through many focus groups in my many decades at ADL, and we still stay with the same mission from 1913, is to stop the defamation of the Jewish people and secure justice and fair treatment to all. And today, ADL continues to fight all forms of anti-Semitism and bias, wherever it happens. In Israel, we have an office in Israel. I'm here with a delegation of ADL leaders. We work to secure a Jewish and democratic state of Israel, living in peace and security with its neighbors. And outside Israel, we work to educate and engage on the challenges and complexities Israel faces at home and around the world. And here in Israel, we also do our anti-bias work, our anti-hate work, and on Wednesday, we will be having a large conference a couple of miles from here promoting social cohesion within Israeli society. So as you've heard from successive speakers today, it's a very time of heightened awareness and concern about the growth of anti-Semitism in the United States. You've heard references to Saturday Night Live just a couple of days ago, to NBA stars, to social media activists, and to very high-profile celebrities. And we have been speaking out about these trends, and we're committed to speaking out about anti-Semitism wherever it happens, whether it's on the right, whether it's on the left, or Islamist anti-Semitism, or anti-Semitism that you can't exactly define what the origin is. And one of the trends that we have been talking about very publicly for the last couple of years is the increase in anti-Semitic expressions related to rhetoric about Israel and Zionism. And I want to be clear that there's always been extreme rhetoric, extreme opposition to Israel, criticism of Israel. But what we've seen in the last couple of years is something very demonstrably different. It's on a greater scale, it's more mainstream, and it's having a direct impact on Jews in the United States. So I want to be clear when I say this, that I'm not talking about differences. I'm not talking about criticism. I'm not talking about critical discourse about the Israeli government, its leaders, or its policies. And there is plenty of criticism, and there's going to be more, depending on what the coalition looks like and depending what policies are implemented, what rhetoric we see regarding Israeli Arabs and other minorities in Israel, about religious pluralism. But even if we disagree with this discourse and this criticism, it's acceptable, and it's not in democratic society, and we don't label that as dangerous or anti-Semitic. What we're seeing is something very different. So these are the trends that we have pulled out from the last couple of years. Number one is the mainstreaming of extremist rhetoric, labeling Israel, whether it's the term genocide, apartheid, colonialism, racist, just very casually used to label Israel and label Zionists and label Zionism as a whole. And we see this from influencers on social media, from celebrities, from public officials, from elected officials. And it creates an understanding and an environment where it's publicly acceptable to just assume that anything related to Israel is equivalent to evil, equivalent to a form of oppression. I'll show you one of my favorite t-shirts that I used to illustrate this. This was for sale at a Netroots conference in 2018 or 2019. And it really illustrates kind of the approach to Zionism and to Israel, that even if you're against anti-Semitism, colonialism, sexism, homophobia, everything that you should be opposed to, Zionism is on that list. And through the vilification of anyone associated with Zionism or with Israel, we see an increase in the use of anti-Semitic tropes about Israel, about Zionism, about Zionists. Whether it's the use of references to Jewish power, to dual loyalty, to Jewish money, all in the context of rhetoric and discussion about Israel and Zionism. We also see, and this was referenced from every single speaker, because Israel is labeled as evil, because Zionism is a form of oppression, anyone considered associated with that is themselves an oppressor or themselves unworthy to be in a movement or a form of movement. So we see this general trend of exclusion or ostracism of maybe self-declared Zionists, but also just of Jews, anyone who is considered somewhat associated with Israel and Zionism, excluded from particular movements. I mean, you are familiar with Rashida Tlaib. A couple of weeks ago, she said, you cannot be a progressive and be a Zionist or be pro-Israel. We see that a number of years ago, you can't be a feminist and you can't be a Zionist. You can't be an environmentalist and you can't be a Zionist. You can't be against sexual violence and be a Zionist. We see it again and again. The most alarming trend that ADL has noted in the last year or so is that as this kind of environment and this rhetoric has grown, the number of documented anti-Semitic incidents or anti-Semitic threats against Jews in the United States has increased. So some of this is from the right, because traditionally on the far, far extreme right, we've seen accusations of Zog, Zionist-occupied government, and the use of anti-Semitic tropes to attack Israel, and this has kind of been going on for decades. But more and more, this rhetoric, this language is being mimicked by the left, and not just the extreme left, more and more mainstream. And it's being tolerated by the center, by the mainstream. You may be familiar with something that came out in June called the Mapping Project. This was it is a website. It's still online. It's being hosted by an Icelandic company that will not pull it down. And it appeared in June online. It's an interactive map that you can play with that highlights community organizations, almost all of them, not all of them, but almost all of them Jewish, in Massachusetts, where the people who put this up, who just call themselves the Mapping Project, we don't know who they are, they say that these individuals and organizations are responsible for the colonization of Palestine and other perceived harms such as policing, imperialism, and displacement. And this map includes 500 organizations, including Jewish youth groups, including Jewish high schools, including arts organizations, including names and addresses. And the Massachusetts Jewish community was terrified when this came out, because somebody looking in it can just say, oh, look who's involved in this whole kind of Jewish enterprise or pro-Israel enterprise. But for someone intent on doing damage, someone intent on taking a violent act, this is a roadmap. It's literally a map to attack Jews. And the call to action on this website, I'm going to quote, "Our goal in pursuing this collective mapping was to reveal the local entities and networks that enact devastation so we can dismantle them. Every entity has an address. Every network can be disrupted." So I mentioned the increase in threats. The Mapping Project, I think, is just kind of the most visible one. But ADL, as you know, every year, like many Jewish communities around the world, we collect data on anti-Semitic incidents. And for many, and the CREEF does it, the CST in the UK, they do it in Argentina, League for Human Rights does it in Canada. And for many, many years, for decades, whenever there are tensions between Israel and the Palestinians, you saw in Europe an increase in anti-Semitic incidents, on attacks on individual Jews, on attacks on Jewish institutions. When tensions rose in the Middle East, you saw an impact in Paris, in London, in Buenos Aires, and elsewhere. It wasn't so much documented, the case in the United States. That changed in May 2021. In that month, in the kind of the biggest recent conflict between Israel and Hamas, we saw 387 incidents in the month of May. 297 of those were within the days of the conflict, between May 10th and the end of the month. That represented a 141% increase from incidents the previous year in 2020, which was during the pandemic, so it was artificially low, but still it was a huge increase, 141%. Similarly, in our audit of anti-Semitic incidents in 2021, 345 anti-Semitic incidents involved references to Israel or Zionism, that's throughout the whole war, compared to 178 in 2020, a 94% increase. we issued a couple of weeks ago a new report on anti-Israel activism on U.S. campuses, just to highlight, these are some of the breakdowns of anti-Israel activity. Many of these incidents may be characterized, not all, but many can be characterized as anti-Semitic. But we saw very many trends, which you've heard about a little bit already. One is the exclusion of Jewish students, of demeaning and ostracizing of those associated with Zionists and Zionism, and an increase in the use of anti-Semitic terminology to talk about Jewish students and to talk about pro-Israel students on campus. The last point I want to make is, how are Jews feeling? So a year ago, ADL and Hillel International did a survey of Jewish students on campus, and we asked them a series of questions. How do you perceive anti-Semitism? Do you experience anti-Semitism, and how? I think it's really interesting. 43% of Jewish students that we surveyed said that they had experienced or witnessed anti-Semitic activity in the last year. And here's a word cloud. When you ask them what was kind of the nature of the anti-Semitic incident, Israel's not the biggest, but it's quite large on the bottom. So the anti-Semitism they experienced was related to the word Israel. Similarly, when you asked, do you hide your identity, or do you self-select out of expressing your Jewish identity? Not a lot, not a huge percentage, but 15% of Jewish students reported that they did need to hide their Jewish identity. And from this word cloud, you could see Israel was one of the main motivators for why they might hide their Jewish identity. I just want to close with a quote from Jonathan Greenblatt, ADL CEO, who wrote about a year ago in the Washington Post. Right-wing anti-Semitism is the lethal Category 5 hurricane threatening to bring immediate catastrophe. Anti-Semitism on the left, however, is more akin to climate change. Slowly but surely, the temperature is increasing. Often people don't perceive the shift, or they choose to ignore it, and even in the face of once uncommon storms. But the metaphorical temperature is rising, and the conditions threaten to upend life as we know them. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Susan, for your disturbing lecture, but important. And please join us. And I would like to welcome now Mr. David Bernstein, founder and CEO of the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values. Mr. Bernstein is a passionate advocate of the free expression of ideas. He's the past president and CEO of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs and former executive director of the David Project. He's the author of the forthcoming book that I saw back there, Woke Anti-Semitism, How a Progressive Ideology Harms Jews. Please, Mr. Bernstein.
Thank you. It's really wonderful to be here among friends. Really happy to be part of this distinguished panel, especially someone I've admired my entire adult life, Alan Dershowitz, who I've been reading since I was a college student. It's really an honor to be on the panel with you. So, a friend of mine who's a historian cautions never to talk about the era that you think you're going in. Leave it to us historians to do that. But I'm going to violate that precept for a moment and say that I think we are entering into a very ideological era that's reminiscent of the earliest 20th century, where communism and fascism and ideas like that had taken hold in massive swaths of the globe. I think we're entering a time in America where ideologies are once again these simplistic ideas that of what explains where we are and how we live are now all the rage. On the right, we have this idea of replacement theory, or the Great Replacement. This absurd idea that immigrants are taking over American society and that Jews are playing an important role in bringing in these aliens to replace ordinary Americans. We're seeing a sort of a unique ideology take hold among certain segments of the black community, black nationalist community that you've heard recently from Kanye West and Kyrie Irving and others. And we're seeing an ideology that shall not be named, but we are going to name it here, woke ideology, which you've heard about. It's very hard to talk about woke ideology in the US and among American Jews. It's a lot easier to talk about in places like this in Israel, and I'm so delighted that groups like Rאות are playing a leadership role in raising awareness of these ideological trends and are helping us in America name the ideology that shall not be named. So what is this ideology? What is woke ideology? What is radical social justice ideology? What is critical race ideology? It holds two key tenets. One, that bias and oppression are not just a matter of personal attitude, but are embedded in the very systems and structures of society. And two, that only those who have experienced that oppression, that bias, have the insight and the qualification to describe it, define it for the rest of society. So you'll hear people say that only black people get to describe oppression against blacks, and only Jews get to describe oppression against Jews, get to define anti-Semitism for the rest of society. The problem is that that second tenet is often weaponized as a way of shutting down discourse. It's a way of saying that you don't have the standing to share your opinion about societal issues, and that's inherently illiberal. But it's also used, that ideology, that weaponized ideology, is also used to promote ideas that we would think of as potentially anti-Semitic. And I want to explain how that's so. So my son, my younger son, who's 17 years old, is learning about, in social studies, that to recognize and resist systems of oppression. That's what the new Montgomery County, Maryland social studies curriculum is doing. Now, you might say, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with learning about systems of oppression? The problem is people are telling you exactly who's oppressed and who the oppressor is. It comes packaged with an ideology of who's oppressed and who's oppressor. In this worldview, success is conflated with oppression. If you're successful, if you're part of a group that is above the mean, you will be perceived as an oppressor group. And so you can imagine, even if the idea of Jews and Israel and Zionism are never mentioned, over time, we are conditioning young people and we're conditioning to society to understand Jews and Israel in a very specific way as part of the oppressor class. That's what will come about. This ideology is also, as others have said, inherently illiberal. It is anti-democratic in nature. It tries to shut down our ability to have conversations. And the more illiberal American society becomes, the more crazy it becomes. Professor Jonathan Haidt often talks about structural stupidity that we're seeing in American society. The more crazy, the more stupid collectively we become, the more anti-Semitic we become as well. And so we've got to guard against that. And by the way, the more we see it on the left, the more crazy the left becomes, the more crazy the right becomes as well. Another key aspect of this ideology is it erases what's unique about Jews. It demands that we give up a part of ourselves. Einat Wilf likes to say that we pay our pound of flesh to it. So among Jewish students, it might be renouncing our Zionism. Among Jewish organizations that are used to being part of coalitions, it might be acknowledging that America is a white supremacist society. In other words, it's no longer enough to be part of social changes and to try to support issues like criminal justice reform. One must now pay the political price, the price of admission, and say that America, this country that represents some of the greatest ideals of humanity, is a white supremacist, oppressive country. That's what's being demanded of us. And people like me are now saying we should not pay that price of admission. It advances this notion of equity that Professor Dershowitz talked about, this idea that anytime a group is not proportionally represented in any field, it is prima facie evidence that there's discrimination. But if you say that, if you argue that that's the case, then only those people, not only is it the case that the people below the mean are discriminated against, but anybody above the mean is automatically part of the oppressor class or is complicit in the supremacy that is bringing about the conditions that the people below the mean are facing. That's going to obviously affect Jews in many ways. And we're just now starting to see that play out in public discourse and in university admissions and in other aspects of American life. Another thing it does, this ideology does, is it downgrades anti-Semitism to a mere whine that the Jews might have. You hear this idea of that anytime Jews in let's say a diversity, equity, and inclusion meeting raise anti-Semitism to be discussed, they are decentering blackness or anti-blackness. We saw this in a case that my colleague Elisa Lewin is working on at Stanford, where a Stanford psychiatrist who raised anti-Semitism in meetings was told that they were taking the spotlight off of racism. So you're not allowed to talk about anti-Semitism even when it's as obvious as Nazi swastikas being placed on a Zoom meeting. That's still removing the spotlight from somebody else's oppression. And the last way, and there probably are more that I'm not mentioning, is that this ideology, unlike any other ideology that that sparks anti-Semitism, makes it impossible to talk, or harder to talk about than it should be. It is the root of cancel culture, so people are afraid to speak of it. They're afraid to speak about how it causes anti-Semitism. Jews, mainstream American Jews, are afraid to speak about how it causes anti-Semitism. I love the quote that, Susan, that you gave from Jonathan Greenblatt, that anti-Semitism on the right is like a hurricane, and on the left is like climate change. But then what are the CO2 emissions that are producing that climate change on the left? It is the ideology that we're too scared of naming, and I was delighted that my friend and colleague William Daroff really didn't just talk about anti-Semitism on the left, just talk about the symptoms, but talked about the ideological underpinnings of that we're starting to see. That's what has to happen. We can't fight something that we won't name. Thank you. So I just a couple of data points. How are we doing? Okay. So I'll just say that the others have talked about the data that we've seen. There is data now on this. We conducted a poll of 1,600 likely voters, and we can now say that the more woke somebody is, the more likely they are going to hold certain negative views of Jews. And I'm really delighted that Fern is going to be doing some more research on that. We need more research on this. But I want to end with just a quick thought about what's next for us. And I know my friend Iran from Rאות said, don't talk about solutions to this. So I know others will talk about it. But I would be remiss if I didn't say that we need to think about repositioning the American Jewish community in the American body politic. It doesn't mean we have to go from left to right, but there are all kinds of allies. Professor Dershowitz talked about Asian Americans who share our fundamental positioning in American society. They are our new friends, and we have not yet gotten to know them yet. So I think that that's one thing we've got to think about. Who are the people who are supporting democracy, who are opposing extreme ideologies on both sides of the political spectrum? They are our friends, and we've got to take steps to get to know them. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bernstein. And now, and he will talk exactly 8 minutes, I would like to invite Mr. Eran Shaishon, the CEO of Rאות Group. Eran joined Rאות in 2004, the year it was established, and served as Director of Policy and Strategy until 2013, leading Reut's work in national security, Israel's relations with the Jewish world, and socio-economic development. Eran, please.
Thank you very much. I don't know what, as one of the organizers, I don't know what went into my head when I thought to place myself after such wonderful speakers. So then I thought, what would be my unique value proposition in regards to this distinguished team? And then I realized it is speaking in Hebrew. They can't compete with that. So with your permission, and I apologize, I will turn into Hebrew. אז אני רוצה לדבר איתכם היום, בזמן קצר שיש לי, על אחד מהתופעות שמהוות מכפילי כוח לאותן תנועות פרוגרסיביות קיצוניות, ואני גם רוצה להזכיר שלא כל התנועה הפרוגרסיבית היא כמובן אנטי-ישראלית. יש חלק קטן מאוד מהתנועה הפרוגרסיבית שמונע מאידיאולוגיה, ובכל זאת, אחד ממכפילי הכוח שלו הוא מה שנקרא הברית האדומה ירוקה. הברית האדומה ירוקה זה למעשה תופעה חברתית, אנחנו לא מדברים פה על ארגון, לפי האסלאמיסטים חוברים לפרוגרסיבים, זו תופעה שראינו באירופה, והפכה להיות אחד מהצירים החברתיים המעצבים ביותר מבחינה חברתית ב-30 השנה האחרונות באירופה. תפיסת העולם של הברית האדומה ירוקה או האג'נדה שלהם היא אנטי-מערבית, אנטי-אימפריאליסטית, אנטי-קפיטליסטית, אנטי-אמריקאית וגם כמובן אנטי-ציונית. ובעשרות השנים האחרונות זאת למעשה התופעה שלדעתנו אחראית במידה רבה לעלייה הבאמת תלולה באנטישמיות באירופה המערבית. צריך להגיד שמה שנתן את הדחיפה לברית הזאת, אחד הדברים, היא תפיסה שנקראת דוקטרינת למברטיזם. לפיה האסלאם הפוליטי, האסלאמיסטים, יכולים להוות משקל נגד האסלאם היותר קיצוני, הסלאפי, מבית מדרשם של אל-קאידה ודאעש. רוברט למברט היה שוטר קצין משטרה בריטי שניהל למעשה את המשא ומתן עם האסלאמיסטים במערב. צריך להגיד שהחיבור הזה בין השמאל לאסלאמיסטים הוא לא מובן מאליו, כשחושבים על סוגיות כמו מעמד האישה או מקומה של הדת, לכאורה שני הזרמים האלה לא יכולים להיות יותר שונים אחד מהשני, ובכל זאת שיתוף הפעולה הזה הוא לא פריך, הוא מעוגן בכתבים, אנחנו רואים פתוות אסלאמיות שמכשירות את שיתוף הפעולה הזה עם השמאל מצד אחד, ורואים כתיבה של אינטלקטואלים מהשמאל שמתייחסים לקהילות מוסלמיות באירופה כפרולטריון החדש, ולכן יש פה ציר חברתי שהוא הרבה יותר חזק ממה שאנחנו נוהגים לחשוב, הרבה פחות אופורטוניסטי. אנחנו כן רואים שכמו שאמרתי, זו תופעה שהתחילה באירופה, אנחנו כן רואים הגירה לארצות הברית של התופעה הזאת. זאת אומרת, שיתוף פעולה כזה תמיד היה. אבל כציר חברתי שיש לו השפעה פוליטית רבה, אני חושב ש-2014 הייתה נקודת ציון מאוד חשובה עם מהומות פרגוסון. כולנו, אני מניח, זוכרים את הסלוגן From Ferguson to Palestine. מה שאפשר את אותו חיבור, הייתה תופעה שכבר הוזכרה פה, אבל אני לא חושב שמישהו ממש הסביר אותה, שנקראת intersectionality, או הצטלבויות בעברית, אני אוהב לכנות אותה התחת מאבקים או קואליציית המיעוטים. intersectionality זה למעשה הגדרה, תופעה, פרדיגמה אקדמית, שהפכה להיות רעיון לאקטיביזם בארצות הברית, שמתאר את הדמיון הרב בין קבוצות אוכלוסייה מוחלשות או מופלות, הן מדגישות את הדמיון שבאפליה שלהם, שבעין נובע ממערכת בבסיס שלה גזענית, וכמובן הגמונית ולבנה, ובעולם שבו היהודים בארצות הברית, המסגור שלהם הוא כיהודים, כלבנים ופריבילגיים, אז כמובן אנחנו בעיניהם בצד הלא נכון של ההיסטוריה. צריך להגיד שמה שעוד תורם בתקופה האחרונה לעלייה ברמת ההשפעה שלהם, הוא שהרבה מאוד אסלאמיסטים, מרגישים שזה תור הזהב של האסלאמיסטים באמריקה. אחרי ה-11 בספטמבר, מוסלמים בארצות הברית, ובמידה מסוימת של צדק מהבחינה הזאת, שהתחושה הזאת הייתה אותנטית, הרגישו תחת מתקפה ורדיפה, בטח תחת ימי הנשיא טראמפ, שאסר על כניסה של מהגרים מוסלמים מכמה מדינות, הם הרגישו באמת ככה תחת מתקפה, ועכשיו הם מרגישים שזה הזמן שלהם לפרוח. וצריך להגיד שההשפעה הדרמטית של הברית האדומה ירוקה, דרך אגב, לא אמרתי, האדומה מתייחס לסוציאליסטים באירופה, הירוקים מתייחסים לצבע האסלאם, לצבע של האסלאמיסטים, ולכן הברית האדומה ירוקה, אנחנו לא מדברים על הרפובליקנים או האנבירומנטליסט, שוחרי איכות הסביבה, כמו שהצבעים האלה משמעותם באמריקה. אז ההשפעה הדרמטית של הברית האדומה ירוקה על החברה ואפילו על מדיניות החוץ האמריקאית, היא תוצאה של פלטפורמות חזקות שמשמשות אותן. האגף הפרוגרסיבי העולה למשל במפלגה הדמוקרטית, הוא בעצם עדות מרכזית לכך. אנחנו רואים שחברי קונגרס שמזוהים עם הברית האדומה הירוקה, משתתפים באופן פעיל ותכוף באירועים שמארגנים ארגונים אסלאמיסטיים כמו CARE, איסנה, AMP, למי שמכיר את ראשי התיבות וכולי. יש בהחלט תהליך של מיסוד, הרבה ארגונים חדשים נוצרים. אנחנו רואים שהם משתמשים בפלטפורמות תקשורת חדשות. ערוץ אל-ג'זירה הקטרי באנגלית הוא שופר מרכזי של דוברים מהברית הזאת, כך גם AJ פלוס, שזה הסושיאל מדיה של אל-ג'זירה, וכמובן שאנחנו היום חיים בעולם של רשתות, עולם של מידע, הארגונים ששייכים או תופסים את עצמם כחלק מהברית האדומה הירוקה, נהנים גם מפלטפורמה של רשת תנועת האחים המוסלמים הגלובלית מצד אחד, וגם רשת ארגונים אנטי-ציונית בארצות הברית. הברית האדומה הירוקה היא אחת הסיבות המרכזיות לעלייה באנטישמיות בארצות הברית ובכמה וכמה דרכים. ראשית, הברית הזאת נתנה כאילו שרשרת חסינות להרבה מאוד איסלאמיסטים, גם כשהאנטישמיות שלהם היא בוטה, בגלל מלכודת האסלאמופוביה, לא ממהרים לגנות אותם. דרך אגב, גם אנטישמיות מוסלמית, אבל גם אנטישמיות שחורה. אנחנו רואים שהתגובה לכמה מהאמירות האלה היא לא מאוד משכנעת. דבר נוסף, תופעה נוספת, אנחנו קוראים לה בראות המחיקה היהודית. המחיקה היהודית הן למעשה התוצאות של המסגור של יהודים כלבנים ופריבילגיים. המסגור הזה הוא לא מסגור שבהכרח מבוסס על שנאה. השיח היום בארצות הברית הוא מאוד דיכוטומי, איטי או נגדי. בצד השמאלי של המפה זה מתרגם ל-oppressed או oppressor, מדכא או מדוכא. אבל גם אם המסגור הזה הוא לא מונע משנאה, הרבה פעמים התוצאה שלו היא אפליה וגם עלייה באנטישמיות. מהבחינה הזאת שתחושת הדחיפות תחושת הדחיפות להילחם באנטישמיות נשחקה. הנורמות החברתיות שהגנו על הקהילה היהודית מפני אנטישמיות נשחקות, כי אם אתם לבנים ופריבילגיים זה כנראה צרות של עשירים. דבר נוסף, כתוצאה מהברית האדומה הירוקה, יותר ויותר אמריקאים מבינים את הקונפליקט הישראלי-פלסטיני דרך הפריזמה של תיאוריית פוליטיקת הזהויות. במובן הזה שאם יהודים הם לבנים, אז המדינה היהודית היא מדינה לבנה ולכן קולוניאלית. ואז אנחנו רואים שבסיבובי הלחימה האחרונים עם עזה, אז צה"ל מתואר כצבא לבן ואימפריאלי שנלחם נגד, ואני מצטט, ארגון של אנשים חומים. חמאס. צריך להגיד גם שהשיח הזה, ופה זה מתחיל להטריד אותנו באמת, חודר גם למיינסטרים, ואנחנו רואים שהשחיקה הדו-מפלגתית, בתמיכה הדו-מפלגתית, בעיקר במפלגה הדמוקרטית, היא פועל יוצר של התופעה הזאת. לברית האדומה הירוקה יש גם השפעה ממשית על מדיניות החוץ האמריקאית. צריך לומר היום שארצות הברית מפולגת, לא מסכימים שם על כמעט שום דבר. אם יש קונסנזוס אחד לגבי מדיניות החוץ האמריקאית, בין שמאל לימין, זה ביחס לצורך לסיים את תפקיד השוטר של העולם מצד ארצות הברית. הפרוגרסיבים מטבלים אותו, את התפיסה הזאת בעוד אלמנט, בעוד תבלין אחד שנקראת מדיניות חוץ מכלילה, Inclusive Foreign Policy. לפי התפיסה הזאת, על ארצות הברית להפסיק להתייחס בסלחנות לעמיתיה שמפירים זכויות אדם, ולכן הם למעשה יוצאים נגד סעודיה, איחוד האמירויות, מצרים וגם ישראל. וצריך להגיד שלתפיסה הזאת הייתה השפעה מאוד גדולה גם על מדיניות החוץ של הממשל, אם זה בעיכוב בקונגרס של הסדרת חבילת הסיוע לישראל, אמנם עיכוב רק של 24 שעות מירתי כיפת ברזל, אבל אני כן חושב שזה אירוע משמעותי. בטח שהחלטת הממשל להקפיא חלק מהסיוע השנתי למצרים היא תוצאה של הפעילות הזאת, גם השהיית מחירת F-35 לאיחוד האמירויות, וגם הכתף הקרה לסעודיה, שלדעתי יש כמה אנשים בוושינגטון שהיום מצטערים עליה. לברית האדומה הירוקה יש השפעה ממשית על העצירה במומנטום של הנורמליזציה, ככל שהממשל האמריקאי דחף אותה, ולכן יש פה אלמנט גם של החלשת הציר המתון. זה מחזק את איראן בפועל, גם אם חיזוק איראן לא נמצא על האג'נדה המרכזית של הברית האדומה הירוקה. אני אסיים בזה שאני אגיד, אני לא אנליסט פוליטי שמתמחה בפוליטיקה האמריקאית, אבל יש סימנים לכך שארצות הברית משתנה, המפלגה הדמוקרטית משתנה, ואולי הנשיא ביידן הוא הנשיא הפרו-ישראלי האחרון במובן המסורתי של המילה במפלגה הדמוקרטית. אני לא יודע אם זה נכון, אבל זה בהחלט נושא שאנחנו צריכים לשים לב אליו, צריך להדאיג את כולנו. אז אני אסיים פה, הייתי בסדר עם הזמן?
2 דקות חריגה.
2 דקות.